Good morning, Dan and Amy. So I asked the question, Illinois families, as we've discussed at length and in detail on this show, and will continue to, pay the highest property tax in the nation, Illinois becoming a home equity desert. You do not own your home. It is collateral for somebody else's pension. You rent it from the government, destroying your value, the value of the large investment you're going to make. That's what's happening. So, of course, suburban Dem state reps who shouldn't be in the offices they are, but Michelle Mussman, a Democrat from Schaumburg, introduced legislation because she's concerned about this.
For what?
To provide property tax relief to Illinois homeowners.
Is this the same one that worked on the antique mopeds? Or
Yes, she is also.
that's what I thought. Her name sounds familiar.
Yes.
I'm kind of paying attention, Dan.
You may know her from other seminal pieces of legislation like the regulation of antique mopeds.
Yeah.
She's busy. She, juggles a lot of balls. The legislation she introduced would increase the homeowner's exemption. That legislation passed the House of Representatives last month, 108-1. The one vote against it is Jeannie Ives, Republican conservative from Wheaton.
Love her.
And she's the only one who actually connects dots and understands public policy, or one of the few in the House and in the General Assembly generally, and certainly understood this, that actually increasing the homeowner's exemption could result in higher property taxes for the same homeowners that Michelle Mussman was trying to provide tax relief for. Incompetent, treacherous, both. You decide. The bill would increase the homeowner's exemption from $6,000 to $8,000 for most homeowners. In Cook County, the homeowner's exemption would increase from $7,000 to $8,000. So the exemption saves a homeowner money by reducing the taxable value of a house, except there is nothing in the bill to stop local governments from collecting the same amount of money as before, or more likely slightly more each year, which is what they do, generally speaking, max out under the cap. That levy spread over a lower tax base would raise the tax rate and eat up any potential savings for many property owners, as the legislative director of the Taxpayer Federation of Illinois, who wrote an analysis of the bill, points out. You're saying less property is taxable, but you're not doing anything to reduce the need of money by taxing districts. So you increase the rate. It's going to hit those with the more expensive house harder, resulting in property tax increase, actually. But we don't do that. We do virtue signaling legislation. We look at intentions, not outcomes in Illinois. And Michelle Mussman, like so many other legislators, thinks that she can continue to snow suburban families with her incompetence or treachery or both, you decide, with matters like this. Phony, baloney property tax relief that you hear from phony, baloney politicians. And you've been hearing it for decades from both sides. And where are we right now? Illinois with the highest property taxes in the nation. For more on this, in the context of the budget deal that is not made, and in my opinion will not be made, and in my opinion should not be made, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Ted Dabrowski, who's the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. Ted, thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Dan and Amy.
So what about that property tax issue? Is that illustrative of the problem in Springfield, as I seem to indicate just now?
I think you're spot on. I think it just creates more of a mess. It sends a signal to try to trick the taxpayers that they're getting a better deal, when in fact it's just making a bigger mess. And one of the things you did leave out that I would add is that by doing what she's doing, she's moving the tax burden around. More of it will fall on companies who are already leaving Illinois. We're going to push our job creators even further away, and by making it more expensive to deal in Illinois, they're going to hire less people. So it's just a ugly, vicious cycle that kind of bill puts us in.
So we're on a 30-day clock. I mean, the technical end of the legislative session is the end of this month, and there's no deal in sight on the budget. And the D.C. and Springfield press corps obsess about this, despite the point that Rauner's made that, look, we haven't had a constitutionally balanced state budget in decades, so passing another phony baloney budget accomplishes nothing other than providing more opportunities for artifice by legislators back to their constituents. And so kind of give us your assessment as somebody who watches this and analyzes the various proposals being bandied about on the prospects for any deal that would actually meet the threshold of being constitutionally balanced and yet responsible and pro-growth?
Oh, I say the chances of that are zero, not even 5%. The chances of some kind of deal that is, again, fake reform, maybe that's out there, maybe that's 10, 15%, but I'd say that there's no deal. And I think the real problem with that, even if we get a fake deal, is that the rating agencies have warned Illinois that if you guys don't get your stuff in order, we're going to downgrade you to junk. And for those people who don't follow credit ratings, and what a junk rating means is that means that we become the financial deadbeat of the United States. No state has ever been rated junk, and so it's much like the guy in the neighborhood who's got the worst credit score. Nobody wants to lend him money. Nobody wants to do business with him. That's the kind of reputation that Illinois has built, and it's about to get worse, if you can believe it.
I know the city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy. Can the state of Illinois file for bankruptcy?
They can't formally file for bankruptcy, but if anybody's following what's happening in Puerto Rico,
Right.
it's a territory that legally can't file for bankruptcy, but it's going through what they're calling now a federally bankruptcy-like process. So in the end, when you can't pay your bills like Illinois can't, you're bankrupt.
And the argument that's being made by Democrats and their sympathizers in Illinois is that runners intransigence is the reason that we're in this crisis, with social service providers not being properly paid for the services provided, as well as other state vendors, $12 billion in unpaid bills, and this prospect of being downgraded to junk status that you were describing, and the outmigration and all of the other afflictions that Illinois suffers from. This is all Ronner's fault. It all started when he was elected and installed in 2015.
Well, I think that's the amazing narrative, and everybody wants to push that. But anybody who's been in Illinois long enough knows that these pains have been going on for 3 decades. We've watched the pension crisis get worse and worse all the time. We've watched the job creation slowly disappear. Manufacturing is largely left the state. These things have been going on for a long time, and they're the consequence of bad deals by the politicians. Edgar's pension ramp. You got Blagojevich's fake pension bond issue that he did. Then you got Quinn's $32 billion tax hike. All of those things were Band-Aids. They never attempted to reform the problems in Illinois. And what's happening in the last 2 years is a culmination of that. And this is the first time that somebody came up and said, no, we're not going to continue to do that, and that was Rauner. So we're in a mess now, but it's not the last 2 years. It has been going on a long time, and Illinois have paid the price with fewer jobs, stagnant wages, the highest property taxes in the nation. It's ugly, and people don't want to admit that this has been a long-term problem, which is why we need a long-term, real fix to what happens in Illinois.
So I'm staring at a headline here from one of the articles that says Chicago's largest pension may run out of cash in as little as 4 years. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely true. We've looked at the numbers as well, and it's absolutely true. They're on that path, and it's you look at the Chicago fire pension, the Chicago police pension. Those things are all bankrupt. They're bankrupt in any way that you can measure it. They're almost out of cash, and if Illinois doesn't go down first, it's Chicago. So it behooves us to come up with a plan, which is why the Illinois Policy Institute put together a balanced budget with no tax hikes. We go after the reforms that are necessary to fix Illinois, and until we address the structural problems, we're going to continue this path toward junk.
And on the matter of public sector pensions, which you have written extensively about, and Illinois Policy Institute has done much investigative work in support of the conversation on those matters. Just to give us a sense of it, because it's always skipped payments is always the argument of the left politicians and the public sector unions. I repeat myself, our politicians have skipped payments, and that's what got us here. If we would have just made our payments all the way along, we wouldn't be in a problem. So it's not the benefit levels, it's just skipping payments, it's political gamesmanship. Now, even setting aside the fact that the public sector unions conspired with the politicians to skip those payments, setting that aside for a minute, the amount of money that we're spending on pensions at the state level, over the last 20 years ago to today, and where we are in funding levels despite the dramatic increases in expenditures on pensions.
I think the first point I want to highlight is, like you said, people love to talk about skip payments, but the reality is that it doesn't matter how much we would have put in. It's really hard to keep up with the growth in benefits. We've handed out benefits like they're going out of style. It's really hard to keep up with those benefits, and so there's just not enough money. And despite now the budget pensions take a quarter of all the spending of the Illinois budget, and yet the hole gets bigger every year. We added up all the debt across the state and local governments, and it's about $267 billion in retirement debt. That's about $56,000 a household in Illinois. That's a massive amount of debt. So if you're a family thinking about moving to Illinois, you got to think about that. If you move here, you're going to get this in addition to whatever your mortgage is, you're going to get handed a bill that says you owe $56,000 over the next 3 decades to pay down this pension crisis. It's just too much.
Well, if I ever get that bill, I'll be tearing it up and leaving
Well,
the keys in my
you're
house.
getting it, Amy.
You're getting it incrementally.
Taxes every year.
Yeah, well, that's it.
No, because a lot of us pay more in our taxes than we do actually paying down our mortgage.
Well, in property taxes, sure. And and Ted's point is an important one. It's not going to happen at once. You're not going to get an invoice for $56,000. It's happening a little by little and increasing littles by littles each year across every revenue stream that's generated by the federal government. In other words, every tax they impose. And Ted, just on this matter of pensions. What people like Ralph Martyr, who's one of the leading lights of the left in Illinois, suggests on pensions, well, look, here's what we do. We just change the amortization schedule, extend it out another 30 or 40 or 50 years, and that's the way we deal with preventing these pension funds that are less than 30% funded right now, many of them, from defaulting.
Well, yeah, I guess Marty Reid doesn't understand the real world. Imagine that you can't pay your debt on your mortgage, and you call up your bank and say, hey, listen, just let me pay you back over 50 years, not 30. You can imagine what will happen. Pretty quickly they'll come take your home when you can't pay your bills. So it's really financially irresponsible for public policy people to say, hey, just if you can't pay your bills, just stretch them out for a longer period. That's wrong. It's bad behavior.
And it just going back to what Amy was picking up with respect to these Chicago pension funds, I mean, my sense of this is just people aren't going to believe the math, frankly, until it is visited upon them. They just won't believe that these pension funds are going to capsize until they actually do, and firefighters and cops and state workers and laborers don't receive their pension check in the mail one day in the not-too-distant future.
Well, what's interesting in the Puerto Rico bankruptcy proceeding right now, the governor there has recommended 401ks going forward and a 10% cut to pensions for existing retirees. And I don't think we're far away from seeing that in Illinois. There's cities across the state have pension funds that are 20% funded, 25% funded. Little cities don't have the means of just raising taxes, or certainly they can't print money. So I think we're just steps away from seeing smaller cities see their fire and police pensions go bankrupt. And then it's going to start a trigger, and it's going to raise a lot of eyebrows as to just how soon will it happen in Chicago.
He is Ted Dabrowski, Vice President of Policy for the Illinois Policy Institute, illinoispolicy.org. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you